On October 24, 1593, a Spanish soldier named Gil Perez was stationed at the Palacio del Gobernador in Manila, part of the Captaincy General of the Philippines. The night before, Governor Gomez Perez das Marinas had been assassinated by Chinese pirates. Despite the turmoil, the palace guards remained at their posts, awaiting the appointment of a new governor. As Perez stood watch, he started feeling dizzy and was overcome with exhaustion. He leaned against a wall, closed his eyes, and allowed himself a moment to recover. When Perez opened his eyes just moments later, he was no longer in Manila. To his shock, he found himself in Mexico City, in the viceroyalty of New Spain, thousands of kilometers across the ocean. Disoriented and confused, he was quickly noticed by local guards, who became suspicious of his unfamiliar uniform and began questioning him. Unaware of how he had arrived there, Perez identified himself as a palace guard from Manila and spoke of Governor Dasmariñas's assassination, a piece of news that had not yet reached Mexico City. The authorities, skeptical of Perez's story, arrested him, accusing him of being a servant of the devil while officials investigated his claims. Months later, a galleon from the Philippines arrived in Mexico, and with it, bringing official news of Governor Dasmariñas's assassination. Among the passengers was a man who recognized Gil Perez and testified that he had seen him in Manila the day after the governor's death, an impossibility, given that Perez had been found in Mexico that same day. With this new evidence, the authorities had no choice but to release Perez, who was eventually allowed to return home. His bizarre and unexplained journey remains one of history's most puzzling stories, leaving open the question of how Gil Perez traveled thousands of kilometers in an instant. In the early hours of October 11, 1945, two police officers in Jacksonville, Illinois, discovered a young black teenager wandering the streets alone. It quickly became clear that he was deaf and unable to communicate verbally. When asked for his name, he could only write Lewis, which was believed to be his identity. However, no records or relatives could be found to confirm his background. With no way to determine his identity or family, a judge ordered him to be placed in the Illinois mental health system, where he would become known as John Doe 24, a name that would define the rest of his life. John Doe 24, believed to have been born in 1929, spent decades within the Illinois mental health system without a confirmed identity. In 1978, his name was legally changed to John Doe Boyd to enable him to apply for Social Security benefits, marking a small but significant step in officially recognizing his existence. After spending decades in mental health institutions, during which he gradually lost his sight, John Doe Boyd was transferred to the Smiley Living Center in Peoria, Illinois, in 1987. On November 28, 1993, Boyd passed away from a stroke at the estimated age of 64. To this day, no one knows who he truly was or where he came from, leaving behind a life of mystery and unanswered questions. Born near Lyon, France, sometime around 1772, Tarare was known as a man unlike any other in history, an anomaly for his insatiable hunger that defied any medical or logical reason. Beginning in his childhood, Tarare's hunger was relentless. By his teenage years, he could and would consume his own body weight in food each day. His never-ending appetite eventually became too much for his own family to handle. They were simply unable to financially keep up with his endless eating, and kicked him out of the home. Forced to survive on the streets, Tarare joined a gang of thieves and beggars, scavenging and stealing just to feed his seemingly infinite appetite. But it wasn't long before he figured out how to turn his unique gift of eating into a spectacle, ultimately becoming a traveling performer who stunned crowds by his eating abilities, for both food and other items. He would eat stones, snakes, corks, and live animals. Despite his grotesque diet, Tarare remained strangely thin. But his overall appearance was far from ordinary. His mouth was unnervingly large, stretching nearly 4 inches wide, lined with stained teeth and thin lips. When hungry, his skin hung loose around his body, but after a feast, his stomach would swell like a massive balloon. His cheeks were so pliable he could stretch them to fit a dozen eggs or apples inside his mouth at once. But Tarare's bizarre ability to eat came at the cost of his physical health. His body was unnaturally hot to the touch, and he was constantly drenched in sweat. A foul, almost unbearable stench followed him everywhere, so overwhelming that people claimed they couldn't stand to be within 20 feet of him. And that was before a meal. After a meal, the odor only intensified. His eyes would redden, his cheeks flushed as if feverish, and a strange vapor seemed to rise from his skin. He would grow sluggish, belching loudly while his jaws moved in unconscious swallowing motions. However, Terrari's outside appearance refused to change in the long term. No matter how much he ate, he never gained weight. And though he was said to suffer from relentless diarrhea, he never seemed to grow weak. Those who knew him found no signs of madness in his behavior, only a strange, detached apathy, as if his mind, like his stomach, could never be satisfied. By 1792, Terrari found himself in an unexpected role, that of a soldier for the French Revolutionary Army. But the battlefield had no mercy for a man with his insatiable hunger. Even when his rations were quadrupled, it wasn't enough. Desperate, he scavenged through gutters and trash, eating whatever scraps he could find. Yet starvation still consumed him. Weak and malnourished, he collapsed from exhaustion and was sent to a military hospital. But Terrari was no ordinary patient. Military doctors, intrigued by his unnatural appetite, subjected him to a series of disturbing experiments. They tested the limits of his hunger, pushing him further each time. He devoured a meal meant for 15 men in a single sitting. He swallowed live cats, snakes, lizards, and even puppies. He was given eels, alive and writhing, and downed them whole without so much as a bite. Military surgeons, seeing an opportunity, proposed Terrari's unique eating ability be used for war. They presented him to French General Alexandre de Beauharnais with a daring plan. He would become a spy. His mission would be to swallow secret documents, slip behind enemy lines, and retrieve them once safely across. It seemed foolproof. But war has little patience for the bizarre. On his very first mission, Terrari was captured by Prussian forces. He was beaten mercilessly, interrogated, and subjected to a horrifying mock execution. Terrari stood at the brink of death, before at the last moment, the Prussians decided he was more pathetic than threatening, and they released him. Humiliated and broken after his failed mission, Terrari was desperate. He begged doctors to cure his unbearable hunger, submitting himself to any treatment they could devise. But nothing worked. No medicine, no diet, no desperate attempt to control his cravings could stop the insatiable void inside him. Unable to resist, he would sneak out of the hospital at night to linger outside local butcher shops, feasting on scraps like a starving animal. But it didn't stop there. Unsettling rumors began to spread like wildfire among the hospital staff. Some swore they saw him in the morgue, hovering over the dead, his rabid hunger driving him to feast on corpses. But then, the horror reached its peak. A 1-year-old child vanished from the hospital. There were no witnesses, no evidence, only suspicion. And all suspicion pointed to Terrari. The hospital had seen enough. A mob formed, chasing him from the grounds, driving him into the wilderness. And with that, Terrari disappeared. For 4 years, he was nothing more than a ghost. A monstrous legend whispered in the streets of France. Then, in 1798, he reappeared. Sick. Dying. His body, ravaged by tuberculosis, was finally failing him. In Versailles, weak and frail, Terrari succumbed to his fate. But even in death, his body held one final horror. During his autopsy, surgeons discovered the true extent of his condition. His throat, unnaturally wide, led directly to a stomach that dominated his entire abdominal cavity, stretched and ulcerated from years of unspeakable consumption. His organs, his liver, his gallbladder, were swollen and filled with pus, his insides corrupted beyond recognition. Terrari was a medical mystery, a man with a hunger that defied all logic. To this day, his story remains one of the most bizarre in history. The Countess of Desmond, believed to be a woman by the name of Catherine Fitzgerald, was a noblewoman of 16th and 17th century Ireland. What makes the Countess's story remarkable is the astonishing claim that she lived to be approximately 140 years old, a feat that sets her apart from almost every other historical figure. Writers from the time period documented that the Countess, even after her purported 100th birthday, would walk several miles every week to her local town market, demonstrating an impressive vitality well into her later years. One of the most well-known mentions of her age comes from Sir Walter Raleigh, the 17th century historian, who referenced her in his work, History of the World. Raleigh claimed that the Countess married during the reign of King Edward IV, which would have made her at least 135 years old when she passed away. The English writer Sir Francis Bacon also referenced the Countess of Desmond's extraordinary lifespan in his work History of Life, asserting that she was 140 years old at the time of her death. One of the most frequently cited stories surrounding her death is that the Countess tragically passed away after falling from a cherry tree at the age of 140. According to the tale, despite her advanced age, she was still active, climbing the tree to pick cherries when she lost her footing and fell to her death. However, the accuracy of these claims is nearly impossible to verify. Birth and death records from her time are scarce, and much of the information about her life and death comes from secondhand sources and writings that have been found from the time period. As a result, her true age at the time of her death remains a mystery. Fulcanelli is a name forever linked to alchemy, knowledge, and an unexplained disappearance for the ages. Fulcanelli is widely believed to have been a French alchemist and scholar active during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, yet his true identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Various theories suggest he may have been a nobleman, a scientist, or even a collective pseudonym used by multiple individuals. Some researchers speculate that Fulcanelli was actually Jules Violle, a renowned French physicist, while others argue he was Jean-Julien Champagne, an artist and alchemical enthusiast closely associated with Fulcanelli's work. Despite these theories, no definitive proof has ever surfaced. In life, Fulcanelli was best known for his two influential books on alchemy and sacred architecture. In these works, Fulcanelli proposed that medieval cathedral builders encoded alchemical secrets into stone, linking architecture to the transformation of matter. His ideas captivated occultists, scholars, and seekers of hidden knowledge. The mystery surrounding Fulcanelli is his sudden and unexplained disappearance in the 1920s. It's as if one day he simply disappeared off the face of the earth. His last known interaction was with his pupil, Eugène Cancellier, who claimed that Fulcanelli had unlocked the secret of the Philosopher's Stone, the legendary substance said to turn base metals into gold and grant immortality. Rumors range from Fulcanelli becoming a reclusive exile to having achieved some form of transcendence. Decades would pass until, in 1954, Eugène Cancellier reported an incredible encounter with Fulcanelli. According to Eugène Cancellier, Fulcanelli appeared far younger than before, as though he had somehow reversed the aging process. This extraordinary claim only fueled speculation that Fulcanelli may have indeed discovered the secret to eternal life. Whether Fulcanelli was a genuine alchemist who mastered the secrets of transformation, or simply an intellectual who cleverly encoded his knowledge, his legend persists. In the first half of the 19th century, 1828 to be exact, a mysterious figure appeared in Europe. A young man whose very existence would become one of history's greatest mysteries. His name was Caspar Hauser, and his life was a puzzle that would turn out to be impossible to solve. On May 26, 1828, Caspar was found wandering the streets of Nuremberg, Germany. He was wearing ragged and torn clothes, could barely speak, and seemed to know little about the world around him. The only item he had with him was a strange note. The note claimed he had been raised in complete isolation and had never seen the outside world. But now, without any explanation, he had been released into society with one request. He wished to serve the king. Caspar's story quickly spread across Europe, drawing the attention of scholars, scientists, and the simply curious. People wondered who he was. Maybe he was a lost prince, or a victim of a cruel experiment, or something else entirely. What struck everyone most was Caspar's ability to learn. Despite his earlier isolation, he quickly adapted to the world around him. He learned to speak, read, and write in a remarkably short time. His curiosity about the world seemed infinite, and with every word he spoke, he shared bits of his mysterious past, of a life spent in the darkness of a small room with only a toy horse for companionship. However, despite his rapid progress in society, Caspar's life seemed to be filled with danger. In October 1829, Caspar was found with a head injury, claiming he had been hit in the head by a masked man. He survived several more attempts on his life, which only brought more questions about him to the forefront. Then, in December 1833, Caspar Hauser returned home one day with a serious stab wound. He said that he had been tricked, told to meet someone in a local garden that promised to tell him the truth about his life and his past. But instead of answers, he was met with a knife. Days later, Caspar would pass away from his injuries, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions and theories that continue to captivate people, even today. The circumstances of his death were as mysterious as his life, leading to numerous theories about who might have killed him, or had him killed. Was he a noble child hidden away for political reasons, a victim of a cruel social experiment, or something else entirely? For nearly 2 centuries now, the world has been fascinated with the story of Caspar Hauser. No concrete evidence of who he really was has ever surfaced, leaving his identity a mystery. In the early 1700s, the waters surrounding the Caribbean were alive with tales of adventure, danger, and lawlessness. Among the most infamous figures of this golden age of piracy was a woman whose name is still mentioned centuries later, Anne Bonny. Born around 1697 in Ireland, Anne was the daughter of a servant woman and a wealthy lawyer. Her early life was marked by a move to the New World, where her family settled in the bustling port city of Charleston, South Carolina. It was in Charleston that Anne's rebellious nature began to take shape. Anne Bonny wasn't one to follow the rules. Even from an early age, Anne's fiery temperament and independent nature were evident. She defied societal norms, refusing to conform to the expectations placed upon women of her time. Obedience and servitude were not in her nature. She just wanted a life on her own terms. Anne's first step into the outlaw world came with her marriage to James Bonny, a small-time pirate with big ambitions. But then, she met the infamous pirate captain Calico Jack Rackham. He was charismatic, cunning, and had no fear of danger, everything that Anne had been looking for. They had an instant connection, and Anne left her husband to join Rackham's crew. There was only one problem: she was a female. To sail among pirates, Anne disguised herself as a man in order to prove herself. But she didn't care. Anne was finally loose of society's chains, and she embraced life as a pirate, and she was good at it. Men that underestimated her didn't make the same mistake twice. She was respected and feared, and had the courage of the most seasoned sailors, and she quickly became a legend among the other outlaws at sea. On the high seas, Anne found an equal in fellow female pirate Mary Read, who, like Anne, had traded a conventional life for the thrill of being an outlaw. Together, they were an unstoppable force, unlike any the Caribbean had seen before. They plundered and pillaged anyone that crossed their paths. They participated in raids, capturing ships and looting their treasures and goods. It seemed like their lives were a mix of constant chaos and danger, but they wouldn't have it any other way. But in 1720, her luck seemed to finally run out. While sailing with Calico Jack Rackham, his ship was captured, and so was everyone on board. Everyone was shackled and dragged to the courts of Jamaica to answer for their crimes. For Anne, Calico Jack Rackham, and his men, there was no escape. The sentence was swift and final, but for Anne, she had one last card to play. Before she was killed, she claimed that she was pregnant, and with that, her execution was postponed. From there, Anne Bonny seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. No records exist of what became of her after her trial ended. She could have died in prison, escaped and started a new life, returned to the seas. Her fate, like most of her life, remains a mystery. Anne Bonny's name lives on to this day, as a legend among legends during the golden age of piracy. Jerome's story begins on a foggy day in 1863, near the village of Sandy Cove, Nova Scotia. On this day, fishermen discovered a man on the beach. It looked like he had been abandoned there. He had both legs amputated above the knees, and he was unable to communicate. The only word he ever spoke was when they asked him his name, and he replied, Jerome. A local family, the Comos, would ultimately take him in, offering shelter and taking care of the man. Unfortunately, without a way to communicate, his past remained a mystery, and speculation ran wild. Some believed he was a sailor who had suffered a terrible accident, washing up on the beach. Others thought he might be a victim of foul play, or even a shipwreck survivor with some kind of brain injury. And even though his voice was never heard, he touched the people of Nova Scotia deeply. He moved from home to home, welcomed by families who saw him as a man in need, and provided him with food and shelter. For nearly 50 years, Jerome lived among the people of Nova Scotia. Families cared for him, and strangers tried to unlock his secrets without luck. And in 1912, he took his secrets to the grave, with his real identity still unknown to this day. On Friday, June 12, 2009, a man carrying a black shoulder bag and standard carry-on luggage boarded a bus bound for Sligo, Ireland. Arriving that afternoon, he took a taxi to the Sligo City Hotel, where he paid for his stay in cash and checked in under the name Peter Bergman. His details seemed inconspicuous at first: thin, with short gray hair, blue eyes, and a tan complexion. He appeared to be in his late 50s or early 60s. According to hotel staff, he spoke with a thick German accent and was well-groomed and neatly dressed. Though he looked like the typical traveler, his behavior quickly became anything but ordinary. The man was a frequent smoker, often spotted outside the hotel with a cigarette in hand. But it was the strange purple plastic bag he carried with him all over town that caught the attention of surveillance cameras. Each time he left the hotel, the bag was full of items or personal effects. Yet when he returned, the bag was mysteriously absent. Authorities later concluded that he must have disposed of its contents, taking care to do so in blind spots of the public surveillance cameras, making it impossible to know what he threw away. The following day, Saturday, June 13th, the man visited the Sligo post office where he purchased 8 82-cent stamps and airmail stickers. On June 14th, 2009, the man left the hotel between 11 and 11:30 a.m., asking a taxi driver for recommendations on a quiet beach where he could swim. The driver suggested Ross's Point, a quiet coastal spot just a short ride away. The man was dropped off at the beach, where he spent some time alone before being picked up and being dropped off at the Sligo bus station by the same taxi. On Monday, June 15, 2009, the man checked out of the Sligo City Hotel, handing over his room key. This time, he carried a black shoulder bag, a purple plastic bag, and a different black luggage bag, unlike the one he had arrived with. He walked through the streets of Sligo until again arriving at the bus station, still carrying all 3 bags. At around 1:30 that afternoon, he ordered a cappuccino and a toasted ham and cheese sandwich at the bus station. As he ate, he examined pieces of paper from his pocket, reading them carefully before tearing them in half and discarding them in a nearby rubbish bin. By approximately 2:30, he boarded a bus for Ross's Point, the same coastal town he had visited just days earlier. 16 people reported seeing him on the beach, where he casually greeted each passerby. He was described by those as relaxed and unbothered. The following morning, Tuesday, June 16th, the story of Peter Bergman took a dark turn. At 6:45 a.m., a father and son were training for a triathlon on the beach when they stumbled upon the man's lifeless body. The man was dressed in purple-striped Speedo-type swimming trunks, his underpants pulled over them, and a navy t-shirt tucked into the trunks. The father and son immediately contacted the police, and by 8 a.m., local doctor Valerie McGowan pronounced the man dead. The post-mortem report revealed disturbing details about the man. His wallet, money, and any form of identification were missing. Despite the man having been washed up on the beach, the Sligo medical examiner found no evidence of drowning. Additionally, there were no signs of foul play, ruling out the possibility of homicide. The examination of the man's teeth revealed a life of frequent dental work. And though his outward appearance suggested good grooming and care, the man's internal health painted a much darker picture. He was suffering from advanced prostate cancer and bone tumors. His heart also showed signs of heart disease. Despite these severe health conditions, the toxicology report indicated that he had no medication in his system, no prescription drugs, no over-the-counter pain relievers. Given his condition, the medical examiner noted that he would have been in significant pain and would require medication to live comfortably, yet there was no trace of anything in his system. Further investigation into the name he had provided at the hotel, Peter Bergman, revealed even more questions. The address he gave for his home in Austria was a fake. No street name existed with the name he provided, either in Austria or Germany. It was evident that the man had gone to great lengths to conceal his identity. After an extensive 5-month investigation, the man's identity remained unknown. He was buried in Sligo, with a modest funeral attended by only 4 Irish police officers. As of March 2025, the man remains unidentified. Despite public appeals in Austrian and German newspapers, no relatives, friends, or witnesses have come forward. The mystery of Peter Bergman continues to haunt both the town of Sligo and anyone who comes across his story, leaving behind a trail of questions that may never be answered. The man known as the Dolly Gray imposter remains one of football's greatest unsolved mysteries. Claiming to be Jack Dolly Gray, an end from Princeton University, he stepped onto the field with a fabricated past. Rumors swirled that he had been an All-American honoree in 1922, but the only player to earn that title at Princeton was Howdy Gray, another end. Despite this, the imposter successfully played in the National Football League during the 1923 season, suiting up for both the St. Louis All-Stars and the Green Bay Packers, his deception going completely unnoticed. In 1923, the imposter confidently approached Ollie Gray, the owner and player coach of the NFL's St. Louis All-Stars, selling himself as Dolly Gray, a celebrated All-American from Princeton. Impressed by his credentials, Gray signed him without hesitation. The imposter took the field for 3 games, but something was off. His performance fell far short of what one would expect from a star athlete. Suspicion grew, and when the truth was finally uncovered, everyone realized that they had been deceived. The man he had signed was no All-American, but an imposter whose real identity remains unknown to this day. Realizing he had been conned, Ollie Gray decided to turn the tables. After a tough 6-0 loss to the Cleveland Indians, Gray, desperate for cash to keep his struggling team afloat, saw an opportunity. He passed the imposter off to Curly Lambeau and the Green Bay Packers, selling him as the best player on the All-Stars roster. From Lambeau's perspective, it seemed like a solid deal. But 2 weeks later, when the Packers faced the All-Stars at Sportsman's Park, something didn't add up. The game ended in a narrow 3-0 victory for Green Bay, yet Lambeau had seen enough. After the game, he confronted Gray, demanding to know the truth about Dolly Gray. Lambeau's suspicions were confirmed. The player had only appeared in 1 game for the Packers and performed miserably. Then, just before their next match in St. Louis, he mysteriously vanished, boarding a train and disappearing without a trace. Cornered, Gray finally admitted the truth. The entire deal had been a joke, a last-ditch effort to offload the imposter and keep his team financially afloat. He assured Lambeau he had always planned to return the money, but by then, the damage was done. The imposter had come and gone, leaving behind nothing but questions. To this day, his true identity remains one of professional football's greatest mysteries. In 1669, a man was arrested near Calais, under the name Eustache Dauger. He was taken into custody, quietly, without trial or explanation. A few weeks later, he vanished into the French prison system, and for the next 34 years he would remain behind bars. Not just imprisoned, but silenced, hidden, forgotten. And always under the watch of the same jailer, Bénigne de Saint-Mars, through 4 different prisons, including the infamous Bastille. To this day, no one knows who he really was. He would become known simply as the Man in the Iron Mask, an anonymous prisoner kept under extraordinary secrecy during the reign of Louis XIV. Over the centuries, the mystery continued to grow. Some said he was a disgraced noble. Others believed he was a political prisoner, perhaps a Marshal of France, or even the Duke of Beaufort. One rumor claimed he was the illegitimate son of Oliver Cromwell. Another, that he was a twin brother of the king himself. Even Voltaire, writing decades later, claimed the prisoner was the older secret brother of King Louis XIV, hidden away to protect the crown. What little we know about the Man in the Iron Mask comes from a handful of documents, mostly letters between the jailer, Saint-Mars, and Louis XIV's Minister of War, Marquis de Louvois. But these were uncovered centuries later, in the 1800s. According to those records, the prisoner was said to be arrested not for who he was, but for what he'd done, though what exactly that was remains a mystery. Louvois ordered that his cell at the prison of Pignerol be sealed with multiple doors, one within another, designed to prevent anyone from overhearing conversations inside. Only Saint-Mars was permitted to see him, and only once a day, when delivering his meals. Despite the later legend, the prisoner did not wear a mask of iron. Contemporary accounts describe a mask made of black velvet, worn only during transfers between prisons or during rare appearances at prayer. Modern historians believe the mask itself may have been used more for theatrical effect than security, a tactic by Saint-Mars to elevate his own status by suggesting he guarded someone important. In 1698, when Saint-Mars was promoted to governor of the Bastille, the prisoner came with him, kept in isolation in the Bertaudiere Tower. The Man in the Iron Mask died there on November 19, 1703, taking his secret to the grave. The name on his burial certificate, Marchioli. That name led some historians to suspect he was Ercole Antonio Mattioli, an Italian diplomat who'd betrayed French secrets. But others aren't convinced. But after 300 years of speculation, only one thing remains certain. Whoever he was, the effort to erase him was deliberate and exhaustive. During the American Revolution, the battlefield wasn't the only place the war was fought. Another war was unfolding in the shadows, one of secrets, false names, and coded letters. In 1778, with New York City under British control, General George Washington and Major Benjamin Tallmadge created a secret spy network. It was called the Culper Ring. Their mission was simple: gather intelligence, stay hidden, and never get caught. And some of their most successful spies in the Culper Ring were women. They were underestimated, overlooked, and in many cases never even suspected. While barred from military service, women like those in the Culper Ring played a vital role in turning the tide of war, passing messages, gathering secrets, and slipping through enemy lines unnoticed. One of them is remembered only by a number: Agent 355. Her real name was never recorded. The number itself, 355, was code. In the Culper Ring's cipher system, it simply meant lady. She is officially mentioned just once, in a letter from Abraham Woodhull, known by the alias Samuel Culper Sr., who wrote to Washington that she was one who hath been ever serviceable to this correspondence. That single phrase is all we have. No name, no details. Operating deep inside British-controlled New York City, Agent 355 risked everything to pass on critical intelligence to the American cause. She tracked troop movements, supply chains, and strategic plans. Information that shaped real decisions made by General George Washington on the battlefield. She worked in silence. She blended in. And the details of her life, even her name, remain unknown. But what little can be pieced together suggests she wasn't just any informant. She may have held a degree of social standing, possibly recruited by Abraham Woodhull himself. She likely lived in the heart of occupied New York and had contact with high-ranking British officers. One theory holds that she was a loyalist by birth, from a family trusted by the British, which would have given her direct access to sensitive conversations. Another suggests she wasn't a formal member of the Culper Ring at all, but a woman with key information passed along by intermediaries. Either way, the risk was enormous. Some historians question whether Agent 355 was a real person or a myth born from patriot storytelling, while others believe she may have helped expose Benedict Arnold's treason. In 1780, she was reportedly arrested. Pregnant at the time, she was imprisoned aboard the HMS Jersey, a British prison ship known for its horrific conditions. There she is believed to have given birth, and died shortly after. Her story, pieced together from fragments, has never been fully verified. Dozens of women have been proposed as possible candidates, but none confirmed. Whether real or legend, Agent 355 has become a symbol of the hidden roles women played in the fight for independence, and of the silent contributions that shaped the founding of a nation. We may never know who she was, but the war she helped fight couldn't have been won without people like her. Between 1918 and 1919, the city of New Orleans lived in fear. A killer was on the loose, a figure who slipped silently into homes at night, striking without warning and vanishing just as quickly. No motive, no pattern the police could prove. Just bodies, blood, and an axe. They called him the Axeman of New Orleans. His attacks began in May 1918 and continued until October the following year. In nearly every case, the method was the same. A back door was chiseled open, the tool left behind as if to send a message, and the killer would strike with an axe, often one he found in the victim's own home. Sometimes he used a straight razor. There was no sign of robbery. Nothing was ever taken. Most of the victims were Italian immigrants or Italian Americans, leading many to believe the killings were ethnically targeted. Some believed he only killed men when they got in the way, that his real targets were women. But nothing was ever proven. No one was ever arrested. Then came the letter. On March 13, 1919, newspapers across the city published a letter said to be from the Axeman himself. In it, he claimed he would strike again at exactly 12:15 a.m. on March 19th, but said he would spare any home playing live jazz music. Some dismissed the letter as a hoax. Others were convinced the killer had spoken. That night, all across New Orleans, dance halls were packed. Amateur bands played in crowded homes. Jazz spilled into the streets, not for celebration, but survival. And just as the letter promised, no one was killed. After that, the Axeman's spree ended, as suddenly as it had begun. He was never caught, never identified. Over the years, dozens of names have been proposed, suspects ranging from petty criminals to shadowy figures with ties to organized crime. But none have ever been confirmed. The Axeman of New Orleans left behind a trail of blood, fear, and one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in American history. The Count of Saint-Germain was a man who seemed to appear out of nowhere, rich, refined, and connected to nearly every royal court in 18th century Europe. Yet no one could say for sure who he was, where he came from, or how he always seemed to be everywhere, all at once. He first emerged in London around 1745, claiming to be the son of a Transylvanian prince. Some said he was Portuguese nobility. Others insisted he was Spanish or Italian. But no country ever took credit for him, and no verifiable birth record has ever been found. He spoke at least 6 languages fluently, played the violin like a virtuoso, painted, wrote music, and held conversations about world events with the casual detail of someone who had lived through them. He also had an uncanny knowledge of science, chemistry, and medicine. He dabbled in alchemy and claimed he could purify gems and remove flaws from diamonds, claims that earned him an audience with kings and queens. He never seemed to age. Over the decades, eyewitnesses described him looking exactly the same. In France, he became a favorite at the court of Louis XV, who used him as a diplomatic envoy. He once spent 5 years in Versailles and never once ate a bite of food in public. When asked about it, he claimed to live on a special elixir, and hinted that he'd discovered the secret to immortality. Voltaire once called him a man who knows everything and who never dies. Even his death did nothing to stop the rumors. The Count was reported to have died in 1784 in Germany. But after that, people kept seeing him. He was spotted in Paris in 1789 during the French Revolution. In 1821, he was seen in Milan. In the 1880s, a woman claimed he was living in New Orleans, still alive, still unchanged. He was seen in Rome in 1896 and again in California in 1930. He never left behind personal writings, no letters, no memoirs, just third-party accounts, royal records, and stories. Some firsthand, others passed down like legend. Some believe he was a master of disguise and deception, using aliases and smoke and mirror tactics to create the illusion of eternal life. Others say he was a charlatan, brilliant but human. And then there are those who think the Count of Saint-Germain wasn't a man at all, but something else entirely. No birth certificate, no confirmed grave, just a name, a face, and a mystery that has refused to die for over 300 years. She was young, beautiful, and completely unknown. Around the 1880s, the body of a young woman was pulled from the River Seine in Paris. No one knew who she was. There were no witnesses, no identification, no reports of a missing person that matched her. Authorities estimated she was around 16 years old, and the cause of death was drowning. Her body showed no signs of violence, but no one could be completely sure. She was never claimed by family, never named. And yet, she would become one of the most recognizable faces in history. At the city morgue, the pathologist, reportedly taken by the peaceful, almost smiling expression on her face, asked for a plaster cast of her features to be made. It became known as the death mask of l'Inconnue de la Seine, the unknown woman of the Seine. The mask spread quickly through Paris. Artists, writers, and philosophers were captivated by her serene expression. Copies were made and sold across Europe. Her face became a muse for painters, sculptors, and poets who projected stories onto her. Tragic, romantic, and often invented. By the early 20th century, her face was everywhere, hanging on walls and appearing in literature. The surreal quality of her expression gave rise to a myth that she had died willingly, almost joyfully, slipping away from life with calm acceptance. But the real mystery remained. Who was she? No record was ever found. No name ever confirmed. Over the years, countless theories were proposed, that she was an actress, a factory worker, a noblewoman, but none were ever proven. Then, in a strange twist of fate, her likeness took on a second life. In the 1950s, a Norwegian toymaker named Asmund Lerdahl used her face as the model for Resusci Anne, the CPR training mannequin used around the world. Her expression, once cast from death, was now helping to teach people how to save lives. To this day, she remains anonymous. L'Inconnue de la Seine, a nameless girl who drowned in Paris, yet became one of the most reproduced faces in human history. A mystery in life, a legend in death. In the summer of 1483, the Tower of London wasn't known for being a place of fear. At least not yet. For two young boys, it was a royal palace with impenetrable stone walls and beautiful gardens to get lost in. 12-year-old Edward, who was to be crowned as King Edward V, and his 9-year-old brother Richard were just children, waiting for the biggest moment of their lives, Edward's coronation. But the road to that day began with tragedy. On April 9, 1483, their father, King Edward IV, died suddenly after an illness that lasted only 3 weeks. At the time, young Edward was living at Ludlow Castle in Shropshire, while his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire. News of the king's death reached Gloucester around April 15th. Richard went to York Minster, where he made a public show of loyalty to the new king, his 12-year-old nephew. And according to the Croyland Chronicle, Edward IV had named Richard as his Lord Protector before his death. But that didn't make Richard's authority certain. The Privy Council, after all, wasn't bound to follow the wishes of a dead king. Still, it was Richard who stepped into the parental role. He was now the man responsible for the young Edward and his brother Richard, their protector, sworn to keep them safe. He was the one who brought Edward to the Tower for his protection. He was the one who persuaded their mother to release Richard from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey so the brothers could be together. But once he had both boys behind those walls, the whole game changed. The palace became a prison. First, their appearances in the gardens stopped. Then, they weren't seen looking out of the windows anymore. Before long, they were gone. Completely. Their disappearance was followed by a ruthless political power play. A preacher declared from the pulpit that the princes were illegitimate. Parliament made it official soon after, stripping the boys of their claim to the throne. With the boys erased on paper, Richard of Gloucester decided they should be erased in life as well. In July 1483, he took the crown as Richard III, and with that, the princes were never seen or heard from again. Think about that for a second. A future king, next in line to the throne, and his heir, just vanished from the face of the earth. It's the question that's haunted history. Did their uncle, the man charged with protecting them, order their deaths? That's the story Shakespeare made famous in Richard III, and it's the one that has stuck for over 500 years. Almost 2 centuries later, in 1674, workers demolishing a staircase in the tower uncovered a wooden box. Inside were the skeletons of 2 children. The king at the time, King Charles II, was convinced they had found the lost princes. He had the remains buried in Westminster Abbey, where they rest to this day. But there's no proof the bones truly belong to Edward and Richard. And maybe that's part of what makes this story so chilling. It's not just about whether a king murdered his nephews. It's about how 2 children, heirs to the throne of England, could be made to disappear in such a brutal way. Their uncle promised to protect them. Instead, he decided that he was only going to look after himself and his path to power. In the crowded, noisy marketplaces of ancient Athens, among the merchants shouting and politicians debating the issues of the day, there was a man who lived in a giant clay jar. He was one of the most famous and strangest figures of his time, and possibly the world's first and most committed performance artist. His name was Diogenes the Cynic, and the stories about him are legendary. Diogenes believed that all of society, its rules, its manners, its obsession with money and power, was a complete scam. His goal was to live a life of total freedom, free from all possessions and conventions. He described his philosophy as living like a dog. In fact, the very word cynic comes from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like. It captured both his shameless way of life and his belief in living simply, without social pretenses. And he wasn't joking. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back, and even discarded his one possession, a wooden bowl, after watching a child drink water with his bare hands. He would walk through the city in broad daylight holding a lit lantern, and when people asked what he was doing, he'd reply, "I am just looking for an honest man." When the great philosopher Plato defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken, stormed into Plato's academy, and threw it at his feet, shouting, "Behold, I've brought you a man." His most famous moment came when he was visited by Alexander the Great. The young conqueror, the most powerful man in the world, was fascinated by this strange philosopher. He approached Diogenes as he was sunbathing and offered to grant him any favor. Diogenes didn't even sit up. He simply looked at the king and said, "Yes, stand out of my light." So what's the mystery here? It's not what happened to him, but who he really was beneath the public spectacle. We have 0 writings from Diogenes himself. Everything we know is secondhand, written down by others years or even centuries later. Some view him as a brilliant social critic, using shock tactics to expose the hypocrisy of the world around him. Others believe he was a genius who understood that the only path to true freedom was to desire nothing. Some saw Diogenes as a mentally ill outcast, whose strange behavior was later polished and romanticized into a coherent philosophy. But to others, his defiance of authority was a profound statement. And then there were some that thought it was simply the mark of a man who could not function within society. We can never know for sure. The real Diogenes is lost to us, hidden behind the larger-than-life caricature. He's the ultimate historical mystery, a man who lived his life in public, yet remains completely unknowable. Maybe that was his final point. He forces us to look at our own lives, our own obsessions, and ask what's really blocking our own sun. Of all the terrifying stories to come out of the misty, jagged coasts of Scotland, none is quite as stomach-turning as the legend of Sawney Bean. It's a tale that feels less like historical fact, and more like a horror story told around a campfire. Most versions place it in the late 1500s, during the reign of James VI of Scotland. The story goes that a man named Alexander Sawney Bean and his partner turned their backs on society and disappeared into the wild. They found a deep cave on the coast of Ayrshire that was hidden by the tides, and they made it their home for the next 25 years. There, they built a massive family, dozens of children and grandchildren, all the product of incest, eventually growing into a clan of nearly 50 people. To survive, they became highwaymen, predators. They would ambush travelers on the lonely coastal roads, drag them back to their cave, and murder them. But they didn't just take their victims' money, they also ate them. The Bean clan were cannibals, pickling the leftovers and storing the severed limbs in their horrifying sea cave pantry. For years, people vanished without explanation. Locals grew fearful, often blaming innkeepers and hanging the innocent, while the real killers remained undetected. The clan's reign of terror ended when they attacked a man and his wife. The husband, a skilled fighter, managed to hold them off as they tore his wife from her horse and butchered her on the spot. He escaped and told the authorities his unbelievable story. King James himself supposedly led a 400-man posse with bloodhounds to hunt the clan down. They finally found the cave at low tide and discovered a scene from hell, a damp, foul-smelling cavern littered with stolen goods and human remains. The entire clan was captured and, without a trial, executed in the most brutal ways imaginable. Reportedly, not one of them showed the slightest hint of remorse. It's a perfect self-contained nightmare. There's just one big problem. There is no real proof any of it ever happened. Historians have scoured the records. There are no court documents mentioning a cannibal clan. No chronicles from that time detailing the disappearance of hundreds of people in Ayrshire. The story first appears in print in the 1700s, centuries after the events supposedly took place, in a sensationalist English crime catalog called the Newgate Calendar. That leaves the real mystery not with Sawney Bean himself, but with the story. Some believe it was propaganda, designed to paint the Scots as barbaric savages. Others think it was a local legend, a dark folktale meant to warn travelers of the dangers of traveling alone. Either way, the story of Sawney Bean has had a powerful grip on the imagination for centuries. The real mystery isn't whether a man could become a monster, but why we, as a society, sometimes need to invent them. Sawney Bean may never have lived, but he represents something deeper. The fear of what humanity becomes when it turns its back on compassion and embraces the dark. It's rare for a single life to contain so much adventure, but the story of the Chevalier d'Eon reads like a dozen lives rolled into one. It's a story that involves international espionage, royal blackmail, military honors, and a mystery so personal it remains unsolved 200 years later. For the first 49 years of life, Charles d'Eon was, by all accounts, an exceptional man. A brilliant lawyer, a published author, and a captain of the dragoons who fought bravely for France in the 7 Years' War. Beyond the battlefield, he carried out covert missions for King Louis XV as part of the king's private intelligence network, the Secret du Roi. In Russia, he is said to have worn the disguise of a woman to secure his position at the imperial court. After the war, d'Eon was sent to London as a diplomat, where his life took a dramatic turn. When his superiors demanded he return to France, d'Eon resisted. Holding state secrets that could have humiliated the monarchy, he leveraged them into a lifelong pension. It was during this exile in London that rumors about d'Eon's gender, which had followed him for years, exploded. The London Stock Exchange even opened a betting pool on if d'Eon was truly a man or a woman. But here's where the story goes from strange to unprecedented. With the death of Louis XV, the new king, Louis XVI, allowed d'Eon to return to France, but only under one condition. He must live as a woman, including the terms that Dayan had to officially declare themselves a woman and wear women's clothing for the rest of his life. The state even paid for the transformation, commissioning gowns and accessories for the celebrated spy. From that day on, the decorated male soldier and spy Charles Dayan became the celebrated socialite, the Chevalier Dayan. She lived this way for the next 33 years, mostly in England, a celebrity known throughout Europe. She even kept up her famous fencing demonstrations, fighting skilled opponents while wearing a full dress and corset. After Dayan's death in 1810, an autopsy was performed, and the doctors found that she had male anatomy. The discovery shocked the public and only deepened the mystery. Dayan lived in a time that had no language for the complexities of gender identity that we talk about today. The mystery of the Chevalier isn't about finding a simple answer, but about marveling at a person who navigated the rigid world of 18th century Europe and forced it to acknowledge them on their own terms, as both a celebrated man and a celebrated woman. On the surface, there was nothing mysterious about Edgar Cayce. Born in 1877, he was a soft-spoken and deeply religious man from rural Kentucky with an 8th grade education. He spent his early years working as a bookstore clerk and later as a photographer. He was, by all appearances, a perfectly ordinary man, except when he fell asleep. Cayce would lie on a couch, fold his hands over his stomach, and enter a self-induced trance. He spoke with absolute clarity, diagnosing the illnesses of people he had never met, sometimes living hundreds of miles away. His voice, calm and precise, described their conditions in technical medical language, prescribing diets, herbal remedies, and chiropractic adjustments. His wife or a stenographer recorded every word. Cayce realized he had this ability when he fell ill as a young man. Struck with laryngitis that left him nearly mute, he entered a trance and described his own condition, a psychological paralysis of the vocal cords. He dictated a cure. When he awoke, his voice had returned. From that moment, the requests never stopped. For 40 years, he delivered more than 14,000 readings, each carefully transcribed and cataloged. People mailed in desperate pleas from across the country, and many swore they were cured by his guidance. As the years passed, the content of the readings widened beyond medicine, into topics such as reincarnation, Atlantis, prophecy, and a vast philosophy that Cayce himself barely understood. That was the strangest part. In his waking life, Cayce claimed no memory of what he said while in the trance. He was just as shocked as everyone else by the medical terms that rolled effortlessly from his mouth. He was unsettled, even disturbed, by the visions of past lives, which clashed with his strict Christian beliefs. He never grew rich from his work, often offering readings without payment. To many, it seemed Cayce was as much a mystery to himself as he was to anyone else. To his followers, he was a prophet, a man who tapped into divine knowledge or a universal consciousness. To others, he was a rare psychological phenomenon, like a savant, a genius whose subconscious mind absorbed fragments of medical texts and, in a trance, reassembled them into something extraordinary. But others believed that it was all an elaborate, decades-long hoax. But if it was one of the most selfless and unprofitable cons in history. The mystery of Edgar Cayce is about the very nature of human consciousness. This was a simple man who, by all accounts, had access to an ocean of knowledge the moment he closed his eyes. Whether you believe he was a prophet, a psychological wonder, or a fraud, you're left with the undeniable fact of the thousands of readings he left behind. A library of impossible information, all from the mind of a sleeping photographer from Kentucky.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Fireside Unsolved. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Until next time, take it easy and be easy, you filthy bastards.